Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Curseof and welcome back to another video. Today we are here for a deck profile for the August 2020 format. This is the Twisted Nightmares Match of the Millennium format with Yugioh in it. For those of you who aren't aware, Yugioh did come out European release only through a Trials of the Pharaoh promotional event for the Speed Duel format. It is not available in the North American TCG at the moment, but because, you know, with the whole virus on the go, we're basically doing everything online. That's the only way to play, and all the online events do have Yugioh legal. So if you're playing competitively at all, chances are you're playing in one of the online tournaments and you're going to need to deal with this guy right here. So with that in mind, we have my top 8 deck list from JDS 2 with Spellproof Armor. So getting into this Spellproof Armor list here, we're going to go ahead and start off with none other than the Skill Spellproof Armor. For those of you who do not know, Spellproof Armor basically simply says that your machine monsters are unaffected by spell effects, and you can also normal summon normal machine monsters for 1 less tribute. Obviously the relevant effect here, or the most relevant effect here, is the fact that your machines are unaffected by spell effects. This is going to stop your monsters from being killed by Offerings to the Doomed, Blast Sphere, and most notably, your opponent cannot Parasite, Cocoon Tribute off your monster. This is because when Parasite is equipped, it is counted as a spell card, and since it's a spell card, your machine monsters never become insects. Thus, you can't Cocoon, and you can't Tribute them. This makes this deck like the anti-meta counter to the Moth matchup, and that's why it is a decent deck in this format, and is actually seeing some pretty good success. So yeah, you're definitely going to want to run the Spellproof Armor skill in the Spellproof Armor deck, and yeah, there it is. So we'll go ahead and let the skill chill up there while we move off into the monster cards here. Starting off, we do have that big promo boy here. We have 3 copies of Yugioh in the deck. So obviously, Yugioh being super powerful, he was super relevant in the advanced format for the longest time, and he's come out to Speed Duels, and he's super relevant here. Basically saying, hey, you have trap cards? Well, now you don't. Yugioh is going to shut down every single trap card on field if they're currently active, or if they're set, you can never use them as long as he's remaining up on the field. And to make him even more powerful, Spellproof Armor says that he cannot be affected by spell effects. So your opponent can't remove him with a Parasite Cocoon combo, they can't Offerings to the Doomed him away. He's basically your boss monster that shuts down traps, can't be killed by spells, so he's only being run over by either bigger monsters or monster effects from either like Old Vindictive or New Doria. Overall, he's super fantastic even without the Spellproof skill, so having him available with more protection than normal is absolutely amazing, and he's basically the mascot of the Spellproof deck. Yeah, overall, fantastic card. Super excited to have this in the format, and 100% necessary out of 3 of. It's also very relevant that he is a dark monster. We'll get into that in a little bit here. But moving on to the next monster in the deck, we have 3 copies of Dekoichi here. So Dekoichi, once again, being a dark machine monster, as you're only running machines in the Spellproof deck, because if you run anything else and it ends up in your graveyard, Spellproof Armor says, hey, well, I'm going to stop working now for the rest of the duel. So you're only going to have your machines. Thankfully, we have a lot of good dark machines in the format, and we have Dekoichi here, already a card that sees a lot of play in the Dark Moth deck. Now coming over to the Spellproof deck here, basically a nice little flip effect that lets you draw 1 card. This is not only relevant so that when your opponent runs it over, you get to draw, but it also allows you to potentially plus, especially going up against Dark Moth, which likes to set a lot as well. And plussing in the Spellproof Armor deck is super important. Spellproof Armor has a lot of issue potentially grinding if they get low on resources while your opponent has more resources. It's not a top deck kind of deck. It's not a deck that says, alright, I can draw one card to save me right now. Chances are, if you're down to one card, you're just losing. But having the Koichi allows you to potentially plus, and being able to plus is just so important. So definitely a 3 of into Koichi here, allowing you to see combos more often, monsters you might need, cards you might need, and allowing you potentially plus. Very essential, and definitely a 3 of. The next monster we have in the deck here is none other than 2 copies of Drallago. I do not see many people playing Drallago in their Spellproof Armor deck. I disagree. I think you should 100% play Drallago. Is he as good as he potentially could be? No, because if your opponent has back row, well, Drallago isn't working, which means he actually even has like a negative sort of partnership with Jinzo, as Jinzo tends to make it so your opponent does have lots of back row. But even alongside that, there's been many times that I actually have either top deck Drallago or had Drallago in hand and was able to go through game either just past some Moths, or my opponent's back row set was a Zoma and they summon Zoma face up, and I say, okay, well that's fine, I'll just bypass your Zoma and attack you directly now. Drallago's effect doesn't come up super often, but when it does, it is absolutely amazing. And alongside that, Drallago's attack plus Jinzo's attack is exactly 4,000 damage, which is an OTK in the speed duel format, and that is very relevant to have here. So 2 copies of Drallago I feel is the best ratio. Obviously not as good as Jinzo or Koichi, but his effect comes up fairly often, and he is very good. For the final monster in the deck here, we get a little bit of a throwback to some of the older Spellproof Armor decks. We get to drop in 2 copies of a Pendulum Machine here. So you have your 2 copies of Pendulum Machine, once again a Dark Machine monster, and it can be just simply normal summoned thanks to the Spellproof Armor skill. But bigger than that, you know, why 2 Pendulum Machine and why not another Drallago, say for example? Well, I feel like you want a balance of the 2 of them, because obviously there's some scenarios where you want Drallago. For example, you might be able to just go in for game over a Moth, or Zoma won't be an answer to you, stuff like that. But with Pendulum Machine, it can help against one of your worst matchups, being the Conflict Warrior matchup. Pendulum Machine is an answer to something like that of Command Knight. Well, Drallago can't swing over a Command Knight. The best it can do is crash. So having that option with Pendulum Machine is very important, and obviously there's some other monsters that Pendulum Machine can swing over. Well, Drallago can't swing over it. So having that 150 attack point difference between the 2 monsters does come in handy, and due to that fact, running a 2-in-2 ratio for Pendulum Machine and Drallago is what I found out to be the best. And yeah, honestly, I think this should be the standard monster lineup for the main deck, 100%. I see a lot of people running different lineups. I see a lot of people still running triple Pendulum Machine and triple Blast Sphere and just not looking at Drallago at all. I really think Drallago is necessary in the deck, and I honestly don't think Giant Mech is worth it at all. I definitely play Drallago over Giant Mech. For more fact than Drallago's attack, when we move off from the monster cards here and move on into the spells, we have 2 copies of Allura Darkness. So Giant Mech Soldier is obviously an Earth monster, while Drallago is a Dark, and you guys will notice that every single monster in this deck profile is a Dark monster. Why we only run 2 Allura Darkness? Simply because, hey, we don't want to banish too many of our monsters, but Allura Darkness is going to help us dig for combos, dig for necessary cards, like maybe Offerings or something like that, maybe a Drallago for game, and it also makes running 3 Jinzos not as much of a brick. Now you open up with double Jinzo, or you open up with a Jinzo too early, okay, that's fine, I'll just activate my Allura Darkness, draw 2, and banish that Jinzo. I don't need it. It's fine. So, definitely need 3 of Jinzo, and you're definitely going to want at least 2 Allura Darkness. I found that 3, you're just banishing too many monsters, and I actually replaced one of the Allures for the second copy of Pendulum Machine. But regardless, Allure of Darkness, fantastic card, and definitely necessary in the spell-proof deck. For our next spell card, we have 2 copies of Offerings to the Doomed. Offerings to the Doomed is honestly the best removal in the game outside of Parasite Paranoid or Inner Conflict. It is phenomenal, just being able to pop your opponent's monsters. If you're not going to see your following turn and you might be able to OTK, then it's actually just a 1-for-1. If you can pop multiple in the same turn, you don't lose multiple draw phases, and just having that quick play removal is phenomenal. And more than anything, this is an anti-meta deck, right? Your Spellproof Armor deck is here to answer Moth. You need Moth answers in the main deck. Well, here's the very first Moth answer in this deck. Besides the skill itself, we have Offerings to the Doom. Your opponent's going to be forced to tribute off their own monster to try and attack you. Chances are they're dropping double Moth, because they're not going to usually spend their skill to attack you unless they have Game or double Moth, because they have to get rid of their own monster. But if you have set Offerings to the Doomed, well, now that's an answer to Moth. That's a way to, kill off that Moth. And because of that, Offerings is super necessary and is definitely required in this deck. And I feel that 2 of is the best ratio here. That will clue up the spell section for us. Moving on to the trap section here. First off, we have 3 copies of Zoma the Spirit. A lot of you are going to be very, very iffy on this. A lot of you are going to say, okay, 3 Zomas, but you're also running triple Jinzo in the deck, and Jinzo is your boss monster of the deck. And Jinzo on field makes Zoma become an infinitely useless card in the spell and trap zone. This seems like very, very bad synergy. Although this is true, you're never going to have a Zoma the Spirit and a Jinzo on the board at the same time. You're going to use your Jinzo, you're going to use your Zoma, sorry, as a way to turbo out Jinzo. Say you go first, right? Going first is not bad with this deck at all. You summon either a face-up Dralago or Pendulum Machine, or maybe you set it to Koichi, and hopefully you can set a Zoma, alright? You pass turn, maybe they kill your monster, maybe they don't. Doesn't matter. You can either end phase Zoma, or if they didn't set anything, you can main phase Zoma, tribute it off, drop a Jinzo. Zoma is a monster that doesn't eat up your normal summon, and gives you easy Jinzo fodder for your deck. Because of that, it's 100% necessary, and beyond just that, like I mentioned, this is an anti-Moth deck. It's your anti-meta deck for the format. Zoma is one of the best answers to Moth as a whole, and is definitely necessary at 3. Next off, we have 2 more Moth answers in the deck. We have 2 copies of Prideful Roar here. Prideful Roar basically says, pay the difference between your life points pay the difference between your opponent's monster's attack and your monster's attack, and your monster gets 300 more attack than your opponent's. This, in my opinion, is the best Moth answer in the format. This is a Moth answer that allows you to draw on your following turn, and some of you might be like, well, whoa, man, that's a lot of life points. Your life points are a resource. Don't worry about your life points unless you're going to die, or if you're going up against burn. But otherwise, life points, simply a resource. Don't worry about going so low. You got to clear that board. You got to get rid of those Moths. You have to plus. You have to gain advantage against your opponents. Prideful Roar is the best way to do this. And along with that, the fact that your Pendulum Machine and your Dralago both have more than 1500 attack means that both Prideful Roars are always active as long as you haven't taken any prior damage, like for going up against Moth. There's been many, many, many times that I've been sitting on a Dralago, had a couple Prideful Roars set, my opponent goes double Moth, tries to swing in, bam, Prideful Roar, done. Bam, Prideful Roar, done. Or maybe a Prideful Roar and Offerings. Having these Moth answers is so important in this deck, and honestly, obviously if Jinzo's on your field, it's not the best answer, but when Jinzo's not on your field, Prideful Roar is amazing. And along with that, it can protect a Dralago or a Pendulum Machine. Then if you can follow up with a Zoma Tribute for Jinzo, well, now you have potential game on board. Absolutely amazing card. Definitely necessary at a 2 of. Wouldn't go 3 for the sole fact that it's not usable while Jinzo's on field. And along with that, you can only actually burn it off twice, going up against Moth, and Moth is your main focus for this card. Finally, for the last card in the deck here, we have one copy of Skill Successor. Skill Successor is very, very useful, not so much for the Moth matchup, but more so for going up against Conflict Warrior or any of the Warrior decks, which are really, really bad matchups for spell-proof armor. This can be a nice little damage step buff to your monster to help them get over any of the Warrior monsters. Along with that, Skill Successor is one of the few trap cards that does have synergy with Jinzo, because it has a Engrave banish effect to buff your monster by 800. So you can actually banish this in conjunction with Jinzo in the damage step to buff a Jinzo by 800, because Jinzo only negates traps on field effect, which means you can actually run over opposing Jinzos as an example with your Jinzo, which is very, very huge. So Skill Successor does take that final slot in the main deck. So far, there's been nothing crazy special about this deck. It's been in my opinion, a standard spellproof deck. If you're playing spellproof, this is what you should be running. The big issue with spellproof is that it is a anti-Moth deck. You go into each matchup saying, I hope I'm fighting Moth, I hope I'm fighting Moth, I hope I'm fighting Moth. And if you don't fight Moth and you fight something else that's meta, you probably just lose. Which is very, very depressing. I don't like going up against Conflict Warrior and auto-losing because I'm playing spellproof. Thankfully, we have a little fix to that. We have a way here to kind of match the Warrior matchup here, the Conflict Warrior matchup, and try and deal with them the same way they're dealing with us. Our very first side deck card here is none other than the Inner Conflict skill. If you can't beat them, join them. Your opponent, you know, you're playing against a deck that isn't Moth, your Spellproof Armor deck is having a rough time, no worries. Stop playing Spellproof Armor. Let's side into a Conflict Warrior deck here. What you're obviously going to do, side at your Spellproof Armor skill for Inner Conflict, side at your 2 Pendulum Machines for 2 Charging Gaias, and bada bing, bada boom, you're set up to take on the Conflict Warrior matchup. The big issue with Spellproof Armor, and this has always been the big issue, is that it is literally just an anti-meta deck to deal with Moth, meaning it struggles so much against many of the other decks in the format. What me and actually Terramaster as well set out to do is to fix that issue, and this side deck right here is what fixes that issue. It helps you with that terrible, terrible Warrior matchup by basically playing a Warrior sort of deck yourself. You already have the 3 tributes for Inner Conflict, you have your 2 copies of Charging Gaia now, you're ready to take them on. Continuing that Warrior deck is an issue theme, we have 1 copy of Offerings to the Doomed. Obviously, it is a card that you side in versus Moth. It's also a card that you side in versus the Warrior deck. Then we have 1 copy of Warrior Elimination. Also a very easy side in against a Warrior deck. And then finally, we have 1 copy of Eradicating Aerosol. Our last 3 cards are simply spell removal cards for monsters. Warrior Limb and Offerings are pretty self-explanatory. You're basically almost always siding these cards in. Well, Eradicating Aerosol is actually a card that cannot be used by many decks in the format. Yes, it's a way to board wipe and take out your opponent's Moths, but the majority of decks actually can't survive double Moth in this format. Thankfully, Spellproof Armor, being the anti-Moth deck that it is, you actually will get an opportunity most times to pop your Eradicating Aerosol if you don't already wipe out their Moths during the attack. This is due to the fact they cannot Cocoon, Parasite, Tribute off your monster, and you have a lot of ways to answer their Moth. Worst case scenario, you end up with an empty board versus double Moth. Best case scenario, you still have another monster, they have double Moth, and you drop Eradicating Aerosol, destroy both Moth, and all of a sudden, you're in a fantastic position. And with that, that is going to conclude the top 8 Spellproof Armor deck list that I had here. Big shout out to Terramaster from Yu-Gi-Oh! Legacy for helping me make this deck. yeah, he had a lot of input in this, and this deck would definitely not be possible at all without his genius. So a huge shout out to him. But regardless, if you guys are sick of playing against Moth and you want to have some fun in this format, well, this is definitely the deck for you. This is your Moth answer, and it actually has a good matchup against other decks as well, thanks to this side deck here. Anyway guys, hope you guys did enjoy this video. If you did, please hit the like button down below and also subscribe if you enjoy my content. And I'll catch you guys all, not tomorrow, but the following day for another video. That's a wrap guys. Peace.